All right, it's time to talk about the good stuff, bouncing mixes. So we've got our list of mix passes, and you'll notice that there are three buttons at the bottom: bounce selected, bounce session, and bounce all. Bounce selected does exactly what it says. Select some mix passes in the list. I'm using command here, or you can do one and then shift to get a selection, or you can just bounce an individual mix, whatever you want to do there. Bounce session will look at whatever is selected, and if you've got multiples, it just looks at the first one that's selected, and it will bounce all of the snapshots for that session. Now, if you have a different session open, it will say, hey, do you want to bounce the session that's open? Do you want to bounce the snapshot that you've selected? So if it's ambiguous, the app will ask you to sort it out. And then there is bounce all, which will bounce every single mix pass in every single session that you've taken. And if you've set up mix passes for an entire album, that could be something in the hundreds. If you're printing stems and all of the mix variants for every single song on a 12-song record, that could easily be 200 mix passes. Click bounce all, and it goes along its merry way and bounces. But let me show you some settings. Here we go. Here are the settings for what happens when you click bounce. So the very first thing that will happen is it will set the session back to the way it was when you took the snapshot. When you click proceed in the take snapshot dialog, it takes a snapshot. It's like a little mini save as of everything that's going on in that session except for the edits on the playlist. But it's the playlist, insert assignments, volume, automation, everything, like I said before. When you go ahead to bounce, you can decide how much of that information do you want to actually restore. You could restore absolutely everything, and that way if something got changed in your session, you can say, you know what, I'm going to bring it all back in. Now, this is the set of data that is like what you get in the import session data dialog, though I think it's a little bit better organized. It's into categories. So really, are you going to need to bring in the comments and the colors and the track views? Probably not. Maybe you need to do sends, groups. Does that really matter? Polyphonic, your elastic audio settings? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I don't know. That's up to you. But you can decide what you want to bring in. So let's say you've done a bunch of mix passes in lots of different snapshots, all set up to bounce a session, and you were waiting for approval. You get your approval, but what they wanted you to do was to tweak something. So you change the volume level of a couple of tracks, and you have changed the plugin settings. You could just say, don't bring in the main volume and the inserts, and then however you have the session saved will now override the snapshot. By the same token, let's say you've done snapshots where the volume changes, like you've done vocal up and vocal down mixes, because for some reason somebody wants that. So then you would turn on main and you could say, just bring in volume information. And then everything else would stay exactly as it was, how you saved the session, but the volume information will be brought in. So your snapshot for the vocal up mixes will turn up the vocals, print all of those mix passes. Then if you've got a vocal down, if that's the one that prints next, it will import the volume for that. And then when it comes back to the main, it will set the volume up for the main mixes. Another thing that's quite useful is there are some plugins that are problematic, and you'll get messages about how a plugin was made inactive due to insufficient system resources when it's a native plugin, so that's not right. But if that happens when you open a session and you're printing unattended, you won't know. So quite often, I will leave inserts and settings and automation on, and that way it will re-import those. So if something opens up and it's inactive, the app will dismiss that dialog box as the session opens automatically, but then it will restore the snapshot so all of your inserts will be restored to the state they need to be. Another example of why you might want to do this is, let's say you're going to print a set of mixes for mastering without the limiter. You're going to print 32-bit without the limiter. Well, then you want to recall your insert settings, because then it will actually turn the limiter off when it prints that set of mixes and turn it back on for the other sets of mixes. So that's what all of this information is up here. Then you've got your Extratrax data. And by the way, there's a main setting here. So let's say that sometimes you import like this, but you want to turn it off. Well, okay, just click main Trax data, that's off. Then you've got what we call the Extratrax data, and this is what's used for all of our special mix passes, the solo pass, mute pass, playlist pass, mini snap pass and the stems passes. This mute will override the mute setting that is in the session. Now, if you have mute automation and you don't disable it, then obviously that mute automation will change the mute state as soon as it starts playing. So it won't override it. So you need to be careful about that if you're trying to set up mix passes on tracks that have mute automation. If you do not import the solo and mute status, this will turn red to show you, hey, this has to be enabled to print batch mix passes. If you're only printing main mixes and everything is just going to be exactly the way you had the session, or you don't want to use special passes and you're doing a snapshot for every mix pass, that's fine. Don't import this stuff. It will just take the snapshot, re-import it however you've got your settings here, print the mix pass. So you can absolutely do it that way. And then the playlists here is for recalling what the playlist settings were. I may actually take this out of the app. This is a very late beta, so it may be that you don't have this option to turn it off anymore, because this is kind of an important part of making sure that everything works properly. So generally, this will be enabled unless you're doing automation mode switching. This will just speed things up a little bit. Then down here, before we exit the settings and actually talk about the bouncing, you can get alerts. I thought that this would be kind of cool. It turns out that this is one of the best features of the app. So you can say, message me after every single bounce pass and then again after the job completes. And what will happen is after each mix pass, you will get a message that says, I've just finished printing mix pass number 7 of 203, and it gives you the name of the mix pass and will say whether it completed or whether it failed. And then if it's able to continue, it will continue, and then you'll get messages about the next mix passes. And then when it finishes, it will say, hey, your mixes are ready, or your mixes are ready with warnings, or the process failed completely. And then you know whether or not you got to get back into the studio and restart it, or whether it's all going. It's really great peace of mind. You can iMessage or you can SMS. So one of the reasons to do SMS is if you don't already have an active conversation with the address that you put for your iMessage, it isn't able to iMessage. So you can either set up a conversation and then you know it will work, or just switch to SMS and give it a phone number and it'll go ahead and text it, or you can email. And that's great. One cool thing, by the way, about messaging yourself is when you message your own address that's set up for iMessage on the computer, it doesn't trigger lock screen notifications or banners or things like that. So it's not going to bombard you with the messages, but every time you decide to check in on it, you'll see, hey, I printed 12 mix passes while I just drank that martini. That's pretty cool. Okay, so those are the settings. And like I said, all of this data is stored in the snapshot, whether you recall it or not. So you don't have to worry that if you leave this off, take a snapshot, and then you want to bring it in, that you won't have it. It will always save all of the information in the snapshot. This is for what happens when you actually go ahead and bounce. So when you bounce, it will order things by sample rate, then sort by session, and then it will very cleverly, I think, go through the sessions in as an efficient a way as it possibly can, sending you notifications all the time. And then what will happen is when these are bounced, you can have a choice, by the way, when you say bounce all, if you say bounce all or bounce selected or even just bounce session, it will ask, hey, do you want to keep them or delete them? So if you keep them, they'll stay in the list, but they will get a little indication that they have bounced, or you can have them deleted as you go. When they have been bounced, you can click a button here and it will select all of the ones that have been bounced. So let's say you had a really large mix job and you were printing overnight and it printed 150 of them, but you've got to get back to work. You can actually cancel a bounce and the app will understand, hey, that got canceled. I'm going to stop right here. It'll go back to the list, but you'll see there'll be a little X in this column for every one that actually did get bounced if you weren't deleting them. And then you can go ahead, click the B. It will select all the ones that have been bounced, and then you can click delete, and it will get rid of all of those. I think that's it. So hopefully This will make your life easier. It certainly made my life easier. This started life as something I wrote just because I was so sick of printing mixes and having to wait for each mix to finish printing to be able to set up the next one. And it's a really difficult thing to stay focused and not make mistakes when you've got to do 100 passes of stems across 12 songs and you have to sit there and wait for each one to go. So now I can set up an entire album's worth of bounces in an hour, hour and a half, if it's a couple hundred passes, and then I can just say go and go do something else. And I hope that's the way you'll use it too. Thanks.